not a big discovery that you made, but at least a discovery that like affected you, and now you're translating that into no code. Because essentially, like if you think about the high line, like that's like the old way of doing things, right? And you're not with visual development and no code, you're not blowing that up and starting over. You're preserving what you've had and building on top of it, which essentially is called an abstraction. So I thought that that was really, really interesting when you said that. But I wanted to pose this question. You talked about working with, I think you said Jeremy, on story based design, right?
Yeah.
How is that? Go
No, it was
ahead.
actually it was the other co-founder Ben, but yeah, but about
Ben,
story driven
I'm
design. Yeah,
sorry.
no, it's all good. It's all good. Yeah,
Sorry.
there's three
Sorry,
of us.
Ben.
No, no, it's all good.
Um, but you talked about story-based design and working on that with Ben in terms of like maybe a book or something you want to put out. But how is that different or similar from another phrase you mentioned, component design? Can you like just repeat and help us like break the two apart in your perspective?
Sure, yeah. So, in my perspective, the kind of story driven design aspect is very much about taking whatever your there's layers of components to kind of what the story is, right? And one of those I think that's maybe the most popular that people talk about and that you've talked about on this podcast is like the origin story, right? What's your origin story? What sparked it? And you'll talk about that when you're first getting started, in your pitch decks, in those types of things, in your marketing materials. And like traditionally, that's kind of like where that has stopped. And stories concepts are really big in the marketing world. And like if you read a bunch of books there, it's very big there. But what story driven design is that it's really taking that to the next level and trying to manifest itself into the rest of like all of your project, right? And so for example, it's like how do you get that stuff into your actual end designs, right? And how do you have your users be able to go through the same story that you experienced, right? So it's like part of it is understanding the specific like points at which that user would struggle like on their journey, right? Like there's a whole story around creating an app, and Adalo is like a part of that, and but there's like a larger story of like, well, you have to come up with the idea, you have to then like be able to iterate on it, you have to be able to get it out into the world, you have to be able to share that story to others, right? So being able to help, I think, your users on that whole entire story journey, and not just focusing on the one aspect, and how does that bring itself into a product level, and then like how do you help them, like how do you create products that them in and of themselves like help create more stories. And this is definitely getting super meta at this point, but like I think that's one of the reasons why no code has really resonated and like is now buzzwordy, I guess. But I think it's like, people are really passionate about it, and that's because like they are able to create a story and they're able to then share, like, there's all the amazing apps or websites or whatever things that get created in no code, like they themselves go through the story of like they had a problem, they were able to find it all, they were able to solve it, and now they're like sharing that. So I think when you can create a product that and you can tap into the story aspect, I think really like you're really onto something there. And anything that you can do to like make that as authentic as possible along the way, I think really kind of resonates a lot.
Wow, that's great. That's great. I love what you just said there. So we'll quickly move on, but it would seem like, to summarize what you said, you're saying essentially that this story-based design is a very like top level lens that guides a lot of what you all are doing and the benefits that you believe you're providing for your users. But then when you talk about component design, it's important, but that's just a thing that's part of the overall like narrative that you're trying to build, which is you're creating a story yourself and you're trying to help makers create their own stories.
Yeah. Oh, and definitely the kind of component design system. Sorry, I guess I didn't quite touch on that one, which is what part of your originally asked. Definitely that aspect, I think, is really, I think design system, there's two things that converged that really made no code possible, I think, recently, in the sense of like, you know, I guess depending on how you define it, like no code, like goes as far back as like a spreadsheet, right? But I guess I'm saying like the new wave of no code that actually has the term no code, and you really can kind of create unique solutions to problems. So I think there are two trends that made that possible. One was development languages are getting better and better and more abstracted, so that it's like actually possible to create it. And then I think the second one is that design systems have now started to be created where, and that goes into that component thing where you're in the tech world, you're able to drag in different components, at least in a dollar, you can drag in different components, but like whatever, you can use different components. And there's like established kind of, like we're all kind of playing from the same rule book a little bit in UX where, or in app design or in web design where I mean, the most famous one is like the hamburger menu where it like, that's almost got out of fashion now, but like, you know, you click it and then like a menu thing drops out of it, right? So like and the people who don't know anything about tech are now starting to like recognize the patterns of like, oh, I know what those things mean, boom, and then something opens up. So that's probably the most like obvious example, and you know, there's tons more like navigation bars with 5 things at the bottom, you know, there's different list types that, you know, all kind of have some standard stuff to them. And so I think those design systems and components have allowed it to be possible for, those have created the building blocks that now no coders use to actually make, and like on like, I think those things exist on most no-code platforms, not just Adala, right? Like all the other ones as well. Like, you know, you kind of have similar setups to some of those things. And there's always ways you can customize those to make them style differently and stuff like that. But I think we finally have now in the tech world, or in the web, whatever UX world, like a set of actual building blocks. And those are the components that then you're able to like really use together. That I don't think really existed, or at least, I mean, they maybe like existed, but no one realized it until like 5 years ago when things started to like come together where it's like, okay, so the dev world like is now getting, the languages are getting more abstract and able to actually create these things more powerful, and design is actually creating building blocks that people can now use and put together to create things. And then the end users of those apps who like my parents who like don't really know much about tech, like no, like, oh, I can click that and I know what's going to happen, and like, oh, I can do this and I know what's going to happen next.
Got it. All right, cool. We're going to move on to